Hello, I'm Dr. Alexandra Anderson, and I'm from the Sheffield Methods Institute at the University of Sheffield. And this presentation today is about data visualization in political psychology. But before we begin and I move on to my next slide, I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our conference and panel organizers. So what is data visualization? This definition from Andy Kirk is particularly useful for this understanding. So data visualization is the representation and presentation of data to facilitate understanding. So we use data visualizations to show trends, patterns, and outliers in our data. And using these types of visuals makes it easier for our brains or our audience's brains to process both big and small data. And why is data visualization so important? Data viz brings data to life, making it far easier for us to understand. It has the ability to take a data set consisting of hundreds or thousands of numbers and condensing it into a single image, and then uses that image to clearly show a story that we otherwise would find hard to see. So here are the 5 key principles of good data visualizations that we will be discussing in this presentation. These are in relation to political psychology, but really are useful and applicable for all data visualizations in all disciplines. And I can only go into a certain amount of detail for each principle given the length of this presentation, but I would be happy to hear any questions or go into any more detail in the panel on Friday. So the 5 key principles we will be discussing today, it will be about choosing the right graph, the right colors, the importance of making your titles, labels, and numbers clear, how you should be considering your audience, and then above all, keeping your data visualizations simple. So the first principle we will start with about creating a great data visualization is first to think carefully about which chart you want to use. An important part of choosing the right graph is deciding actually when to use one. So part of this is considering when a good table will still be more effective than a fancy visualization. When you want to show precise values, this is when it might be best to stick with a simple table. However, if you want to show the trends, patterns, or changes over time in your data, then use a visualization. And we have an example here from the House of Commons Library in their report on UK election statistics from 1918 to 2019. And we can see how they chose to use a table for showing the precise values of the election turnout for separate countries within the UK. But then on the right, they used a graph to show the overall turnout, which didn't precisely need those numbers. So when you're thinking about creating your data visualizations, you need to think that some graphs will be more appropriate than others for specific stories that you are trying to tell with your data. So let's go over a few examples of what that means. So we have scatter plots, which can be used when you want to show correlation. So correlation charts, scatter plots, are useful for when we want to denote association between 2 quantitative variables. And sometimes it can even be more than one variable. So we have this example here that's showing, it's a faceted graph showing how the amount of education or the age, so for example on the right it's more than 65 years old, will affect this demographics voting for Leave or Remain in the Brexit vote in 2016. And then another graph you might want to use is the bar chart. So bar charts are useful for size comparisons. So here we have a bar stacked proportional graph, and you should use these when you want to show the size and proportion of data at the same time. So here's an example of how you would use that when we have a graph here about how 1 in 5 Britons have an unfavorable opinion of people who fly national flags at their home. And we can see that with the separate flags for each country or the overall union, having those bar graphs and the stacked proportional means that we can actually see not only what is the difference in size for people's opinion, but also the proportion of these sizes. If you're trying to emphasize changes or trends over a period of time, then you'll want to use a line chart. These periods of time can be short, for example, a day, or they can be an extended period, and this is also called a series. And this period can be decades or centuries, years, and they're used to show the relationship between 2 or more variables. So we have an example here of a line chart showing how over 2018, young people were less likely to say that they would vote Labour, but that the Conservatives are not necessarily the beneficiaries of this change in opinion or this change in who they wanted to vote for. On the right, we have an example of a pie or donut chart, and this is when you want to compare the parts of a whole. So essentially, we're trying to show how a single entity can be broken into its component elements. And we use this type of chart when we want to compare parts of a whole and not when we're trying to compare the differences between groups. So pie charts or donut charts are a useful way of showing how a total amount is divided up, and often this takes a form of a percentage, as we can see in this example here when people were asked about their choice between who they thought would be the best prime minister between Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May. So there's some really useful tools out there to help you kind of think about what is the best graph to use for the stories you want to tell with your data. And one of them is the Financial Times Visual Vocabulary, which I highly recommend on the website I've posted here. This is a screenshot of what that website looks like. It's interactive and it shows you 9 different types of charts and all the different actual graphs within those charts, within those types of charts that you can use in order to tell very specific data stories. So our second key principle for good data visualization is choosing the right colors. You should use color to draw the attention or to clarify for the audience what the key trends, outliers, etc. are in your data. So color is not simply about brightening your graph or creating nice aesthetics. They need to have a purpose. It is also really important to note that about 8% of men and 1% of women have some form of color vision impairment. Many can still perceive color, but certain colors, such as green or brown, are transmitted to the brain differently. And this is actually one of the most common impairments, which is dichromatism, which means that it's very difficult for the viewer to distinguish between red and green. So you should be considering this when you're choosing your color palettes. And when you're choosing your color palettes, you also need to think about what is the appropriate color scheme to use. So you might want to choose sequential when you want to show data that is ordered from low to high. And traditionally this is shown with the lowest as the lighter shade and the highest as the darker shade. You might want to use diverging color scheme for when you want to highlight a particular middle range of quantitative data. So for this you would want to use 2 contrasting unrelated colors to show the extremes of the data, and then the middle range can be a lighter mix of the 2 or simply the absence of color. And then you can use a qualitative color scheme for when you want to present qualitative and not quantitative data. So in the sense that you're wanting to show categorical values. So this could be, for example, a type of demographic, a country, and you want to show the clear and obvious differences between this data. So you want to make sure that the colors are unrelated. Our third key principle for good data visualization is just to really make sure that you have clear titles, labels, and numbers. When you're creating your graphs, you want to ensure that you're employing useful and explanatory titles. This provides immediate focus for what you are presenting to your audience. So titles provide your audience with their first key insights. It focuses them on what you're trying to say or argue with your data. And then with axis labels, they should also be simple and straightforward, and they should also be quite succinct. Think short and sweet. And for your numbers, when you're creating a scale, you should always start at 0 when you're labeling your axis. However, it's also acceptable if there is a significant reason not to. For example, your data could be clustered at an unreasonably high value. An example here of where the economists made a mistake in terms, or not a mistake, but maybe not the right judgment for how they portrayed their scale can be seen here. So this is an article where they went over some past data visualizations they did and commented on how they improved them and showed us how they would. So we can see on the graph on the left that they used the scale, the axis label, to show 2 different types of scale, when this could actually be a little bit confusing. So they thought that actually in hindsight, it would have been better and it would have been easier for the audience to understand if these 2 graphs were just shown separately, but right next to each other, in order for those numbers on that axis for that scale to be clearer and more understandable. A really important principle for good data visualization is considering your audience. Who is this data visualization for? All of your data visualizations should be designed with your targeted audience in mind, and the information that you think they will need should be included here that will be necessary for them to quickly understand. That also might mean simplifying the graph itself. So for example, you might not want to use the same graphs that you created for a journal article, which can be for a highly specialized audience. You wouldn't want to in turn then use this graph for a public piece, such as a news article, a blog post, or a piece in the conversation, or even in a tweet, because it might not be as digestible. Studies have shown that for a public audience, the public's interactions with graphs and their understanding can be influenced by their emotions, their time that they have, or even the confidence in their own skills to be able to read graphs. So an example perhaps of how we need to consider our audience is this example here from the Prime Minister's coronavirus press conference on October 31st to announce a second lockdown. This was a COVID heat map to show the positive cases for England by age group and region. But we have to keep in mind that some people were using different types of mediums to watch this press conference. So people might have been on TVs, tablets, phones, and actually seeing this much data in a really small space was not very conducive to its understandability because there was just too much going on and the numbers were actually too small for what they were trying to show. So the age group already is quite difficult to see on the left-hand side, but it's very difficult to actually differentiate, for example, the really small numbers that you can see in each individual square. So this is a really obvious example, and it was critiqued quite widely about how you need to consider your public audience and the way you want to communicate your data in order to really help them understand what is the story you're trying to tell. So finally, and above all else, the most helpful key principle for good data visualizations is to keep it simple. You want to focus on the data. Make sure the data is central to the story you're telling. And although charts should be visually appealing, you want to ensure that the data and the story you're telling is the sole focus, rather than any artistic flourishes you add. You want to make sure that you're not adding elements that are too distracting, and if you add unwanted information, this can be in the form of extra color, background images, extra labels that maybe aren't necessary. This may make it actually more confusing for your audience and make your data visualization much less effective. And this defeats the purpose of a data visualization. A crucial element of the best data visualizations is that they fit the ultimate goal of simplicity. So to conclude this presentation, I will leave you with a quote from Edward Tufte, who is one of the classics on data visualization. And he says that graphical excellence is that which gives to the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest time with the least ink in the smallest space. So think about how effective can you make that small image showing the most data in the quickest way for your audience to understand it. Thank you very much for watching this presentation today, and I look forward to hearing any questions or comments in our panel on Friday. Thank you.